The year is 1867. The place is a dimly lit room inside the Russian Foreign Ministry in St. Petersburg. Outside, the wind is screaming off the frozen Neva River, rattling the windows like an angry ghost. But inside this room, the atmosphere is even colder. Around a massive oak table sit some of the most powerful men in the Russian Empire. There's Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, the Tsar's younger brother, head of the Russian Navy, and a man who's seen enough naval disasters to know when a ship is sinking. There's Mikhail Reutern, the finance minister, a German-born numbers guy who looks like he hasn't slept in 3 weeks. And there's Alexander Gorchakov, the foreign minister, silver-haired and cunning, the kind of diplomat who could sell ice to Eskimos, which, ironically, is sort of what they're about to do. They're all staring at a map spread across the table. A massive yellow stain covers the top left corner of North America. It's a territory twice the size of Texas, filled with forests so thick you could get lost for months, mountains that scrape the sky, and rivers absolutely packed with salmon. This is Russian America. We call it Alaska. And these men are about to sell it for $7.2 million, about 2 cents an acre, less than what you'd pay for a decent coffee today. Now, if you're like most people, you've heard this story before. Russia made the dumbest real estate decision in human history. They sold Alaska for pocket change, missed out on billions in gold and oil, and basically handed America the geopolitical victory of the century. The end. Idiots. Except, what if I told you that's not really what happened? What if the Russians weren't idiots at all? What if, from where they were sitting, with the information they actually had, selling Alaska was actually the smart move? Yeah, I know. Sounds crazy. But stick with me here, because this story is way more interesting and way more tragic than the version you learned in school. To understand why these men are even having this conversation, we need to rewind to 1856. Russia had just gotten absolutely hammered in the Crimean War. Now, when I say hammered, I don't mean they lost a few battles. I mean they got exposed. For centuries, Russia had been the boogeyman of Europe. Not a literal animal, but a nickname, the Russian bear, a symbol Europeans used to describe a state that seemed impossibly large, brutally strong, and almost impossible to defeat. Russia didn't need advanced weapons or clever tactics. It relied on scale, endless land, endless men. If an army was destroyed, another one appeared. It had so many soldiers they could just throw bodies at any problem until it went away. Napoleon learned this the hard way in 1812, when he invaded Russia with the greatest army Europe had ever seen and watched it disappear into winter, distance, and attrition. After that, European kings stopped thinking of Russia as a normal country and started treating it like a force of nature, slow, heavy, terrifying. But the Crimean War revealed something no one wanted to believe. The Russian bear was sick, really sick. So here's what happened. Britain and France decided they didn't like Russia expanding into Ottoman territory, modern-day Turkey and the Middle East. Britain and France weren't reacting out of principle or sympathy for the Ottomans. They were protecting their own interests. Russia was pushing south toward warm water ports and influence over key trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. If Russia gained control over Ottoman territory and access to the Mediterranean, it would threaten British naval dominance and French commercial power. For London and Paris, this wasn't about defending the Ottoman Empire. It was about stopping Russia from becoming too powerful in a region that mattered enormously to global trade and imperial balance. So they did something that seemed impossible. They invaded Russia itself. They sailed into the Crimean Peninsula and laid siege to the fortress city of Sevastopol. Russia fought on its home turf. They had more soldiers. They had the advantage of shorter supply lines, and they still lost. Why? Technology. The British showed up with rifles that could shoot accurately from 300 yards away. The Russians had muskets that were basically useless beyond 50 yards. The British had steamships made of iron. The Russians had wooden sailing ships that might as well have been from the 1600s. The British had telegraphs for instant communication. The Russians had guys on horses carrying messages. It was like showing up to a gunfight with a sword. Sure, you're brave. Sure, you've got heart. But you're still going to lose. The military defeat was humiliating. But the financial disaster? Oh no, that was catastrophic. Wars cost money. Lots of money. To fight the British and French, Russia had done what broke governments always do. They printed more rubles. Millions and millions of them. This caused something beautiful, called inflation, which is just a fancy way of saying your money becomes worth less because there's too much of it floating around. It's like if everyone in your town suddenly had $1 million, a loaf of bread wouldn't cost $3 anymore. It cost 300. The value of the ruble collapsed. At the same time, Russia had borrowed heavily from European banks to buy weapons and supplies. The war was over, but the debt remained. And debt doesn't care that you lost the men you lost. Debt still wants to get paid. By 1856, Russia was spending almost a third of its entire national budget just paying the interest on its loans. not paying down the actual debt, just the interest. Imagine if a third of your paycheck went to credit card interest every month, and you'll understand why Finance Minister Reutern looked like a zombie. The new Tsar, Alexander II, who'd just taken the throne, looked at his empire and saw a financial black hole. Russia needed to modernize. It needed railroads to move goods and troops. It needed factories to build steel and weapons. It needed to abolish serfdom, which was basically slavery by another name, and create an actual economy instead of a medieval feudal system. All of that required capital. Money. Lots of it. But here's the problem. Nobody wanted to lend money to a loser. Russia's credit rating, basically a measure of how likely you are to pay back your debts, was not looking good at all. The big banking houses in London and Paris, the Rothschilds and the Barings, were nervous. I mean, who wouldn't be? They wanted to see stability before they'd open their stuffed vaults again. And this is where Alaska enters the story. Here's what you need to understand about Alaska in 1867. To the Russian government, it wasn't a prized colonial possession. It was a money pit. There was this organization called the Russian-American Company. Think of it like the British East India Company, except instead of looting India for spices and textiles, it was supposed to be harvesting furs in Alaska, and the most valuable of those furs came from the sea otter. Sea otters aren't just another marine mammal. They have the densest fur of any animal on Earth, up to 1 million hairs per square inch on its body, which makes their pelts incredibly warm, soft, and luxurious. That wasn't just a fashion statement. In Qing-era China, that kind of fur wasn't just clothing, it was status. Wealthy merchants and officials paid premium prices for sea otter pelts, often several times more than fox or beaver skins. At its peak, the Russian-American Company was exporting thousands of pelts each year, bringing in millions of rubles in trade and forming the backbone of Russia's commercial interest in Alaska. Now take a step back. Key phrase there, I said. Supposed to be. Because by the 1860s, after decades of relentless harvesting to meet global demand, the sea otter population in the North Pacific was nearly hunted to extinction. There just weren't enough animals left to sustain the fur trade anymore. What had once been a lucrative business became a loss-making enterprise, with the Russian-American Company bleeding cash as the supply collapsed and the costs of maintaining remote outposts continued to rise. Turns out, if you hunt an animal for 80 straight years with zero regard for sustainability, you run out of that animal. Shocking. I know, right? The Russian-American Company was bleeding money. It wasn't just breaking even, it was actively losing cash. The Russian government had to send subsidies across Siberia just to keep the lights on in their Alaskan settlements. So Russia wasn't just broke. It was also subsidizing a failing business on the literal other side of the world. But it gets worse. Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's brother and the head of the Navy, was lying awake at night staring at maps, and what he saw terrified him. Alaska shared a massive border with British Canada, and Britain was Russia's mortal enemy, the country that had just kicked their ass in Crimea. The British Navy ruled the oceans. They had 47 warships in the Pacific. Russia had 12. Constantine did the math. If another war broke out between Russia and Britain, and everyone assumed it would eventually, the British would simply sail into Sitka, Kodiak, and every other Russian port in Alaska and take it. Russia had no Pacific fleet strong enough to stop them. They couldn't send reinforcements across Siberia fast enough. Building the kind of navy they'd need to defend Alaska would cost 45 million rubles, more than 6 times what they'd eventually sell it for. Alaska was militarily indefensible. Constantine wrote a secret memo to Foreign Minister Gorchakov. In it, he laid out cold, brutal logic. America is the future of this continent. Eventually, the United States is going to want to control all of North America. If we hold on to Alaska, we'll eventually lose it to the British in a war, and we'll get nothing. Better to sell it to the Americans now, while we can still get paid for it, and make a friend in the process. It was a strategy of cutting losses, a fire sale, damage control. Now, before you think everyone in Russia agreed with this, they didn't. There were people who wanted to keep Alaska. Naval officers stationed in the Pacific argued that Alaska was a strategic gateway to Asia and future trade with Japan and China. Governors in Russia's Far East pointed out that the fur trade, while declining, still brought in 200,000 rubles a year. Some economists noted that there were reports of gold deposits in Alaska's rivers. These weren't stupid arguments. They were legitimate strategic concerns. But they still lost the debate. Why? Because of one simple, brutal fact. Russia needed cash now. Not in 10 years, not in 50 years, right now. The empire was facing debt payments that were coming due. If they missed those payments, their credit rating would crater even further, and they'd never be able to borrow again. The entire modernization project, the railroads, the factories, the military upgrades, would collapse. Finance Minister Reutern made it simple. Even a small sum from selling Alaska would help stabilize the ruble and keep the European bankers happy. It would show that Russia was serious about fiscal responsibility. So in December of 1866, the decision was made they'd sell Alaska. The priority wasn't getting the best price. The priority was closing the deal fast and getting hard currency into the treasury. Russia picked their best diplomat for the job, Baron Eduard de Stockel, the Russian ambassador to the United States. Smooth, charming, fluent in English, and talented at reading people. They gave him his orders: get as much as you can, but get it done. Stockel was about to become the world's most consequential real estate agent. Meanwhile, in America, here's where the story gets interesting, because honestly, America didn't actually want Alaska at first. It was the mid-1860s, and the United States had just finished tearing itself apart in the Civil War. 600,000 men were dead. The South was in ruins. The economy was exhausted. The government was drowning in war debt of its own. For 4 years, the country had been locked in the bloodiest conflict it would ever fight against itself. Brother against brother. Cities burned. Railroads were destroyed. Entire regions were left economically shattered. The war itself had grown out of a long simmering crisis over slavery and power. Southern states had built their entire economy on enslaved labor and feared that the growing industrial North would eventually outlaw it. When Abraham Lincoln was elected without carrying a single Southern state, that fear tipped into panic. One by one, Southern states seceded, convinced that staying in the Union meant economic and social ruin. What followed wasn't just a moral conflict, but a violent struggle over who controlled America's future, an agrarian slave society or an industrial capitalist one. Washington had financed the war by issuing massive amounts of debt and printing money, leaving inflation high and public trust fragile. The nation had survived, but barely. What Americans wanted now wasn't expansion or grand visions of empire. They wanted stability, rebuilding, healing, anything that didn't involve another enormous bill. The last thing most Americans wanted to do was buy a frozen wasteland from the Tsar. But there was one guy who desperately wanted it, William Seward, the Secretary of State. Seward was an expansionist, someone who believed America's destiny was to control the entire continent. He looked at a map and saw Alaska as a bridge to Asia, a gateway to trade with China and Japan. He saw natural resources, strategic positioning, and room for American growth. He also saw a chance to make history. Seward was ambitious. He wanted a legacy. He wanted future history books to say, William Seward, the man who secured America's Pacific Empire. The problem? Everyone thought he was crazy. Newspapers mocked him. They called Alaska Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and Wall Russia. Political cartoons showed him buying polar bears and icebergs. Congress wanted nothing to do with it. They had zero interest in spending millions of dollars on what looked like a frozen wasteland. But Seward was patient. He waited. And in March of 1867, Eduard de Stockel showed up at his door with an offer. It's the evening of March 29, 1867. Stockel goes to Seward's house to tell him that the Tsar has approved the sale. He suggests they meet the next day to finalize the treaty. Seward was at home that evening, playing cards with his family, when Stockel arrived with the news that the Tsar had approved the sale. Instead of suggesting they wait until morning, Seward immediately pushed back from the table and made his decision. There was no reason to delay. If this deal was going to happen, it needed to happen now. He knew that every extra hour gave Congress time to interfere, to organize opposition, to kill the agreement before it was even born. Stockel hesitated. The State Department was closed. There were no clerks on duty, no staff available to draft documents or prepare maps. Under normal circumstances, the process would have taken days. Seward didn't care. He told Stockel that if the Russian delegation could assemble their people by midnight, he would be waiting at the State Department, doors open, lamps lit, ready to finalize the treaty before dawn. Now, I want you to appreciate how insane this is. These men are about to transfer ownership of a territory the size of Western Europe, and they're doing it in the middle of the night like they're buying a used car on Craigslist. Why the rush? Because Seward knew that if Congress had time to think about it, they'd block it. He needed to present them with a done deal, signed and sealed, before they could organize opposition. So at midnight, the gas lamps are lit at the State Department, clerks are dragged out of bed, maps are spread across tables. The Russian diplomats and American officials work feverishly through the night, drafting the treaty, drawing boundary lines, and deciding the fate of an entire territory. And here's something they barely mentioned: the people who actually lived there. Alaska wasn't empty. It was home to the Tlingit, the Haida, the Aleut, the Yupik, and dozens of other indigenous nations. They'd been living there for thousands of years. They had their own governments, their own economies, their own trade networks. When the Russians first showed up in the 1700s, these weren't helpless victims waiting to be colonized. The Tlingit, in particular, were fierce traders and warriors. They'd negotiated with the Russian-American company from positions of strength. They'd fought wars when necessary. They'd made alliances when it benefited them. But on this night, March 29th to 30th, 1867, not a single indigenous person was in that room. Their lands were being transferred from one empire to another, and nobody asked their opinion. The treaty stated that Alaska's inhabitants would be admitted to the enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. That was a lie. It would take more than a century before Alaska natives would actually receive anything close to equal rights, but that's a whole other story. At 4 in the morning on March 30th, the treaty was signed. Seward had just bought an empire for $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre. He was thrilled. He thought he'd secured America's future. Stoeckel was relieved. He sent a telegram to St. Petersburg. Treaty signed, $7.2 million. But the drama wasn't over. Not even close. Signing a treaty is one thing. Actually paying for it, that's another. The United States Congress, specifically the House of Representatives, had to approve the money. And they were in a foul mood. President Andrew Johnson was wildly unpopular. He was facing impeachment, Congress hated him, and by extension, they hated his Secretary of State, William Seward. Many congressmen saw the Alaska Purchase as a wasteful vanity project designed to boost an administration they despised. The debates got nasty. Congressmen called Alaska a frozen desert. They asked why America needed a polar bear garden. They argued the money should go to rebuilding the South, not buying icebergs. The treaty was in danger of failing. Stoeckel panicked. If he went back to Russia without the money, he'd be disgraced. The Tsar was expecting that $7 million. The finance minister was already planning how to spend it. So Stoeckel did what desperate people do. He bribed Congress. The Russian government authorized a secret slush fund. Estimates put it between $100,000 and $200,000. Stoeckel hired lobbyists. He wined and dined influential congressmen. He placed favorable articles in newspapers. And yes, cash in envelopes changed hands. The representative of an autocratic empire was buying American democracy. Now, before you get too scandalized, remember, political bribery in 1860s America was rampant. This wasn't some unique corruption, it was just how things worked. Still doesn't make it right, but context matters. And look, I get it. You're probably thinking, why should I care about a real estate deal from 150 years ago? Fair question. But here's the thing. This story isn't really about Alaska. It's about how empires collapse. It's about how smart people make terrible long-term decisions because they're trapped by short-term problems. It's about how debt can force a superpower to sell off its future just to make it through the month, and it mostly affects people who are not anywhere in the corridors of power. And if you're noticing parallels to the present, that's because history has a habit of repeating its pressures, even when the names and dates change. Well, eventually, after months of debate and backroom dealing, Congress voted to approve the funds. The check was cut. But Russia didn't want a check. They wanted gold. So the $7.2 million had to be converted through a complex series of bank transfers involving American banks, British banks, and the Rothschild banking house, until finally, gold bullion was deposited into Russian government accounts in London. And where did that money go? Not to schools, not to hospitals, not to developing Siberia or improving life for ordinary Russians. It went almost immediately to pay interest on railroad loans. The sale of Alaska essentially paid the mortgage on Russia's railway system for a couple more years. That's it. On October 18, 1867, the official transfer ceremony took place in Sitka, Alaska. Russian troops lined up on one side of a flagpole, American troops on the other. The Russian flag was lowered, except it got stuck halfway down. A sailor had to climb the pole and cut it loose. The flag fell and landed on the upturned bayonets of the Russian honor guard. Some of the Russians saw it as a bad omen. They weren't wrong. Most of the Russian colonists packed their bags and left. They didn't want to live under American rule. The indigenous peoples watched with a mix of confusion and dread. They hadn't been conquered. They hadn't agreed to anything. But suddenly they had new rulers who spoke a different language and brought different laws. For the next 30 years, it looked like the critics were right. Alaska was ignored by the American government. It was governed by the military, then by the Treasury Department, then barely governed at all. It was a lawless frontier. Most Americans forgot it existed. Russia, meanwhile, took its $7 million and kept trying to prop up a dying empire. And then history decided to play a cruel joke. 1896, almost 30 years after the sale, a prospector named George Carmack is panning in a creek in the Yukon Territory, just east of Alaska. He finds a gold nugget the size of his thumb. The news spreads like wildfire. The Klondike Gold Rush begins. Within months, 100,000 people are stampeding north. Most of them pass through Alaska to get to the gold fields. This wasn't a casual migration. It was one of the largest mass movements of people in modern history, driven by desperation, greed, and rumor. Men abandoned jobs, families, and entire towns on the strength of a single newspaper headline. Steamships were packed beyond capacity. Supply stores were emptied overnight. The journey itself killed thousands, avalanches, starvation, disease, but that didn't slow the rush. Alaska became the choke point of the entire frenzy. Every trail, every port, every river, bottlenecked through territory the United States had nearly forgotten it owned. Towns spring up overnight, fortunes are made and lost. And the gold? Oh, it keeps coming. Millions of dollars worth, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. Gold didn't just enrich prospectors. It built banks, railroads, shipping companies, and entire regional economies. San Francisco exploded into a financial hub. Seattle transformed from a struggling port into a boomtown almost entirely because it became the supply gateway to Alaska and the Yukon. The ripple effects of Alaskan gold reshaped the American West for decades. The United States made back the purchase price of Alaska 100 times over, just from gold. But wait, there's more. In the early 1900s, massive oil deposits were discovered. We're talking about Prudhoe Bay, one of the largest oil fields in North America. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, billions upon billions of barrels. Oil changed everything. What had looked like frozen emptiness suddenly became fuel for cars, ships, factories, and eventually modern warfare. Alaska wasn't just sitting on oil, it was sitting on the kind of resource that powered the 20th century. Once that was clear, no one laughed about the purchase anymore. Alaska became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. And then came World War II. Japan invades the Aleutian Islands. Alaska became a critical military front. Suddenly, that useless icebox is a strategic buffer protecting the continental United States. Japan's goal was simple: keep the United States distracted and stretched thin in the Pacific. By occupying remote American territory, Japan forced Washington to defend places it had barely thought about before. For the first time, Americans had enemy troops standing on U.S. soil since the 19th century, and it shattered the illusion that Alaska was distant or irrelevant. Then, the Cold War. By the late 1940s, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had collapsed, replaced by fear, suspicion, and nuclear weapons. Alaska became the first line of defense against Soviet bombers. Radar stations, Air Force bases, early warning systems. If Soviet aircraft ever came over the Arctic, Alaska would see them first. Not hours later, minutes. The frozen north became America's early warning tripwire, a place where the fate of entire cities could hinge on a radar signal. The territory that Russia sold to avoid conflict with Britain becomes the front line against Russia. Soviet military planners, sitting in Moscow, staring at maps, watching American fighters scramble from bases built on land their great-grandfathers sold for 2 cents an acre. The irony is almost too perfect. But here's where we need to be honest about something. It's easy to look back and call the Alaska sale a catastrophic mistake. We know about the oil, the gold, the Cold War bases, but that's not how decisions work. In 1867, oil wasn't valuable. Petroleum was used for lamp oil and machine lubrication, that's it. The internal combustion engine barely existed. The concept of a petroleum-based economy was science fiction. The gold in Alaska required industrial mining technology that didn't exist yet. You couldn't just walk up to a creek and scoop out millions of dollars. The Klondike Rush happened because of new extraction methods developed in the 1880s and 90s. And the strategic value of Alaska for air defense? There were no airplanes in 1867. The Wright brothers wouldn't fly for another 36 years. You can't blame someone for not predicting 3 technological revolutions. So was Russia stupid to sell Alaska? Here's a better question. Given what they knew, with the information they had, facing the constraints they faced, was it reasonable? And honestly, yeah, it kind of was. Russia was bankrupt. They couldn't defend Alaska, they needed cash immediately, the territory was losing money every year. And they genuinely believed that keeping it would mean losing it to Britain in the next war for free. From their perspective, getting $7 million for something they'd lose anyway was smart. The tragedy isn't that they were stupid. The tragedy is that they were trapped. Russia's real problem wasn't Alaska. It was structural. They had an economy based on serfdom, basically slavery, until 1861. They had no middle class, no domestic capital, no way to fund their own industrialization. They were trying to become a modern industrial power, using borrowed money from rivals who wanted them to fail. Alaska was a symptom, not the disease. Even if Russia had kept Alaska, discovered the gold themselves, and tapped the oil fields, it probably wouldn't have saved the empire. The problems ran too deep. The corruption was too entrenched. The social structure was too rigid. By 1917, just 50 years after selling Alaska, the Russian Empire collapsed completely. The Tsar was overthrown, the Bolsheviks took power, and one of the first things the new Soviet government did was default on all those foreign loans, the same loans that selling Alaska was supposed to help pay. The Rothschilds, the French banks, the British creditors, they all got told to pound sand. Russia wasn't paying. The financial house of cards that Alexander II tried to save by selling Alaska came crashing down anyway. Today, if you stand on the western edge of Alaska and look across the Bering Strait, you can see Russia. It's only 51 miles away. On the Russian side, you've got Chukotka, remote, underdeveloped, one of the poorest regions in Russia. On the American side, you've got Alaska, wealthy, strategic, packed with resources and military infrastructure. The contrast is stark. It's a monument to the path not taken. Russians still feel a weird sense of loss about Alaska. There are urban legends, totally false, but persistent, that Alaska was only leased for 99 years and America refused to give it back. Or that the ship carrying the gold payment sank and Russia never got the money. These myths aren't true, but they reflect a psychological wound that never quite healed. In the Soviet era, nobody wanted to talk about how the Tsars gave away Soviet territory. It was embarrassing. It was a reminder that the old regime had been weak. But in modern Russia, there's a renewed interest in the story. Putin-era historians frame it as an example of Western exploitation, Russia forced by circumstance to sell valuable land to a rival that would eventually become an enemy. They're not entirely wrong. The sale of Alaska is the ultimate what-if scenario. What if Russia had held on? What if they'd found the gold themselves? What if Alaska was Russian territory during the Cold War? The entire 20th century could have looked different. Soviet bases in North America, missiles in Alaska during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a completely different strategic balance. But history doesn't work on what-ifs. History works on decisions made by real people facing real constraints. And the decision to sell Alaska was made by men staring at a balance sheet that was hemorrhaging red ink. They weren't thinking about the next century. They were thinking about the next loan payment. They sacrificed the long term for the short term. And in doing so, they proved something that's still true today. The most dangerous threat to a great power isn't an invading army. It's compound interest. So the next time you see Alaska on a map, that massive peninsula reaching toward Asia like a grasping hand, remember what it really is. It's not just a state. It's a monument to imperial bankruptcy. It's a receipt for a bill that a dying empire couldn't pay. It's proof that in the game of nations, the most powerful weapon isn't a cannon or a warship. It's a promissory note. The Russians who sold Alaska weren't fools. They were finance ministers and grand dukes desperately trying to save an empire with a broken economic model. The Americans who bought it weren't geniuses. Seward got mocked as an idiot for years, until gold proved the critics wrong. What happened was this. One empire in decline sold a territory it couldn't afford to keep to a rising power that didn't yet know what it had bought. Both sides thought they won. History had the last laugh. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that we should be smarter than those men in St. Petersburg, but that we should be more humble. Because the future has a habit of making fools of everyone's certainty. The sale of Alaska teaches us that history isn't a story of smart people versus dumb people. It's a story of people making hard choices with incomplete information, trapped by circumstances bigger than themselves. Empires don't fall because of one bad decision. They fall because of 1,000 accumulated debts, 100 unforced errors, and a dozen structural problems that nobody wants to fix until it's too late. Russia's empire didn't end in Sitka on that October day in 1867 when the flag got stuck on the bayonets. It ended 50 years later when the whole rotten system finally collapsed under its own weight. Alaska was just the canary in the coal mine, a warning sign that nobody heeded. And if that story resonates with you, if you see patterns in it that feel uncomfortably relevant to today, if that's you, subscribe. Thanks for reading, or watching, or however you consumed this. I'm Malcolm, and this is where history meets economics. Here's another moment where history met economics.